Welcome everyone. My name is Thomas Steininger. I welcome you to Radio Evolve, our global webcast for consciousness and culture. I'm very happy to have with me Kejal Savla and Ashok Krishnan from Mumbai, India. Kejal, Ashok, welcome to Radio Evolve.
Hello, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to have you. Both of you are part of a youth movement in Mumbai, which is called the Blue Ribbon Movement. And you're in the middle of a campaign for deep democracy, a model that you're using, Sun, that you have learned from Mohan, a teacher and a Gandhian activist who developed this for many years and worked in tribal villages in India. And it's a model of deep democracy that works with consensus. And I find it fascinating to see how deep forms of democracy are not only developing in India, but also originating in India. Because when you think about democracy, at least from a European perspective, you think about Greece and European, but that's in itself is a colonial perspective on democracy. There are other roots of democracy, and Indian is not only the biggest democracy in the world right now. I just heard today, we are recording this on the 26th, you have Republic's Day in India, which is a celebration of your democracy also to a degree. And so India is a huge democracy, and India has deep roots in democracy. And part of the roots are also in rural India. And you, as a youth movement in one of the metropolitan areas in India, if not, one say, the global metropolitan area in Mumbai, you are on one hand connected to the metropolitan areas around the globe from New York and London, but also you are connected, of course, to India, to your own roots and to rural India. And you as a youth movement are connected to this deep democracy process that you call RAN. And I'm just very curious about it. What is this RAN? Where does it come from? How does it work? How did you get acquainted with this? Why are you fascinated by this? So if one of you, just whoever wants to start and tell me a little bit, RAN, consensus democracy, what is this? Whoever the two of you wants to start. Or maybe Kejal, you wanna jump in?
Sure, I can start, and then Ashok, you can keep adding. So for us, some of our ideas and principles did start a lot from just the readings of Gandhi and Vinoba. Being in India, we cannot miss the presence of Gandhi in social work and how his ideas came into picture. So his inspiration, and of course from him, Vinoba Bhave, who's considered to be his spiritual successor. And some of his ideas are really way forward from where Gandhi started. And he really spoke a lot about collective consciousness and collective decision making in the last parts of his years. And they started more from, he did something called as Bhudan movement, which is called the land gift movement, where he went to people and evoked from the spirit of oneness that, why don't you come and give your land, and then we can give it to the poor people who don't have. And the amount of land he was able to bring all across India and redistribute was massive. So in an experiment, it was really shifting for a lot of people in India. And what happened after that is still some people fought over it, some people took back, and there were a lot of issues later on. So from his own reflections, eventually he came down to this idea saying that it's not about one person being able to really move a lot of people. Eventually, if we really have to move, the consciousness needs to shift. And for consciousness to shift, of one person is not important, but all of us is important. And hence he brought in this idea of collective decision-making. And from there, the whole collective consciousness will emerge, because in each other's presence is when we can learn. And he set up something called as Brahma Vidya Mandir. It's an ashram for women in interiors of Maharashtra, because he realized women didn't have access that time to these spaces and they couldn't really come and pursue again something that came up from his life. So this is one of our initial inspiration and starting off of this idea. But we also found that one place where this actually was experimented and really alive was Mendha, a tribal village in Maharashtra again. And Mohan Bai was one of the person who's really helped set up this thing in Mendha and really guided the tribals also on how to kind of distinguish some of the learnings and move forward. So these tribal people in Maharashtra already had a spirit or a social justice angle in what they were doing in the way they would decide, but they were not really able to take it to other aspects of their life and other ways of decision making in their village. So Mohan Bai coming to their village was in one way something that started off this for them. And Ashok, maybe you want to add a little bit around how from there it inspired us as a youth movement to take up.
Sure. So, like Kejal said, the whole thing for us, the whole concept of deep democracy for us started with the readings and everything. But when Abhishek, who's the co-founder of the Blue Ribbon Movement, he came in contact with Mohan Bhai. That's when the real understanding and deepening the whole collective's understanding of the deep democracy concept, the 100% consent-based model, that emerged. So Mohan Bhai is someone like Kejal said. He's someone who has been in Mendha for the last 25 years, and he has been working and helping them build their democratic processes, build their lives around this. So when we got to learn from him, from it's like directly learning from someone who has actually started it or started implementing it in a large space. That was a shifting moment for us. So then a few questions that came for us was, so the village in which Mohan Bhai works, they have common needs, they have common understanding, they have common resources which needs to be talked about, which need to be worked about. How can we, who are living in an urban space, who are living our own lives, along with being part of a youth movement, we not necessarily always have a common need. We don't necessarily share a common space. How can we develop and engage in this process of Sarvanumati, as we call it, the 100% consent model? How can we engage in it? How can we take it further? How can we build our expertise of that sort, or capability would be a better word? How can we build our capability in running a youth movement which can actually work on this model, which can actually make decisions based on 100% consent? So that's how it came to us, and it has been say more than 3 years almost since we have been like following the principles of 100% consent, following the principles of deep democracy in taking the work which initially Vinoba and then Mohan Bhai did in Mendha, in taking that work forward, and also at the same time deepening our understanding of the same process.
What I find very fascinating are several things. One, and thank you for Kejal for bringing this in, this whole deep democracy movement is something that also starts with Gandhi. And Gandhi, of course, is one of the world figures also of the integration of a spiritual consciousness perspective and a deep democracy perspective. He stands maybe like no other, also on a global scale, for this understanding that consciousness change and society change go hand in hand, and it has to have deep spiritual roots. And it seems that this is something that is very much alive also still in India. And also, maybe not everyone, I guess everyone does know that Gandhi also had a very focused point on what was happening in the Indian villages. Not only focusing on the metropolitan areas, but what's happening in the country communities, in the tribal communities, also in the smaller nations that are part of India, in the indigenous nations. And it seems what Mohan found there in this village, in this rural area, is also an indigenous population who still has very much their own roots in their own relationship to the land, to the country, to the people itself. and from there understanding that democracy does not necessarily mean that the majority decides against the minority, but that it means that people can come together, let's put it as one voice. And this 100% consensus, Ashok, that you are pointing at, is basically coming together as one voice. Of course, one can say, yeah, that's maybe easy for people who are still related to nature and in small indigenous communities. But for modern time, that's kind of an illusionary process. And so for modern times, we need democracy as we know it from Europe, as a democracy with majority and minority, and the majority rules and the minority has to submit. So you are in an interesting position being a youth movement in Mumbai, which is very much connected to all the cutting edge developments around the world. But you learn from a process that comes from the Indian countryside. And you seem to be very fascinated about this 100% consensus model. Can you tell me why and how? What happened when you heard about this? What was your process working with it? What were your doubts? Does it really work with you? What are the difficulties, and what is the learning process? Maybe Ashok, if you want to continue, because you just started that also.
Sure. So the process, how it started. So 3 years back when we went for a retreat, we have this process called retreat where we go on biannual retreats where we reflect over our year, reflect over how the movement is working, and it's a space to also relax and get back stronger for the upcoming months. Mm-hmm. So there actually is when we started the conversation around Sarvanumati, or 100% consent-based decision making. And we did 3 days of intense study circles amongst all the people who were present to understand, first and foremost, understand what it is, what is it that we are trying to talk about, what is it that we are trying to adopt. And then actually going into a 100% consent decision making of adopting the said model. Because at the core of it, I feel unless and until all of us agree that such a model where 100% consent is taken from everyone, if everyone is not on board with it, we cannot go forward. Mm-hmm. So in a way, you need 100% consent to implement 100% consent model. So that's how it started back in 2018. And quite frankly, when it started, after the 3 days, I was very skeptical. I myself was very skeptical. A couple of us were, because we had never heard of how can we go, how can we take 100% consent from everyone? How will this process go? There were a lot of questions around it, about it slowing down the whole process, about it not being efficient, about it unnecessarily stretching a point or in a dialogue or in a conversation because just one person is not agreeing to it. Because we have always been exposed to a majoritarian democracy, majority wins kind of a thing, where like if the 51% that Mark is saying something, that needs to be done. But what we did understand was, even though the 51%, even though the majority is saying, there is a large, considerable number which is saying otherwise. And we cannot ignore it. Even if that number is not, say, 49%, even if that number is, say, 10%, even if that number is 1%, it is some number which is saying otherwise. And it is important to hear that voice. Because otherwise, in a way, we are being violent on them by not listening to them. And non-violence is at the essence of the 100% consent model. Because if you're able to get everyone to speak, if you're able to hear everyone speak, if you're able to get everyone's opinion, and then you go ahead, there's a lot of ownership that comes in that decision. There's a lot of accountability, self-accountability from the people who have actually passed the decision that comes, as well as it is not violent at all, because you are taking consent from everyone. Everyone is essentially saying that, okay, I am okay with doing it. I do not have a problem with doing it, or I'm at least okay to try it out. If not like completely on board, I'm okay to try it out, give it a chance. So that's how we started from 2018. It has been a long road, I would say. There were a couple of decisions which we felt, okay, it is going to take long time. The process is taking too long to get completed. But then at the end, what we realized was, once that long time of dialoguing has completed, it is actually what comes out. The result that comes out is very, very much finished. It is not a work in progress afterwards. Because a lot of time, just because for efficiency, we might take decisions based on what the majority is saying, and then keep on reworking it because the system fails or because something is not working. But since we spent a lot of time in actually building the system, in actually building what needs to be done, or in actually having dialogue with everyone, taking everyone on board, the system was kind of very flawless. I won't say completely flawless, but close to it. So the post working, once the decision has been made, reduces. So overall, if you see the efficiency aspect, which we had doubts in, I personally had doubts in, that actually gets covered, because in the long run, it comes down to same but better, and in a non-violent way.
Maybe also as a question for you, Kejal. I mean, one would think consensus democracy is very slow. Basically, everything gets impossible. One person has some opposition about something, and you have to discuss it for ages. And you are a youth movement who organizes also leadership in Mumbai, in the metropolitan area. You organize people how to change society in the city, in the country. You have to make decisions. Is your experience really that that this is a process that is not slowing you down, that is helping you? And if so, how?
Right. That's always the first, dilemma that comes in, that it will slow down the decision-making process. And I will not deny a part of it is, it does slow down some parts of it, and it does take a little bit of time. It is a process of building patience. But alongside, I think the question then comes, is that slowness worth it? And I think for us in our experience, eventually we've come down to realizing that some amount of things do get slowed, and specifically in the beginning of it, when we were really setting it up, because we were starting from scratch. We had to really decide every small bit, like which will be the values, which will be the principles, how will that come in, because we were adopting it from a tribal village where people were staying together in a land-based community, and we are a purpose-driven community. We stay at different parts, and we're all volunteering. We don't even have full-time to engage in it. So for us, we really had to adopt everything from scratch, and hence rebuild the entire system in a way that really fulfills the reason why we are coming together as a community. And that did take a lot of time for us. It did also need us to kind of set in our own boundaries and our own ground rules. And in the process, it was slow for us, but as we are developing, we're also realizing that it also built a shared sense of understanding and coherence of a very different type, or of a very different quality. We didn't have to we don't, as an when we compare ourselves with an organization, since we call ourselves a movement, we can really contrast some of the things. In an organization, only a couple of people are at the leadership top. The founders are the people who go and represent the organization, and they are the only people who are well informed, and they're the only people who can keep doing certain quality roles. And what happens is, everybody else in the pyramid of the organization then becomes somebody who just has to do the things that have been said. But since we've always started the base together, and everything was discussed, and the knowledge and the information kept coming to the collective, the base was so strong of knowledge that now anybody from BRM can actually go and represent BRM, because everybody's shared sense of understanding is very similar. So it took a time in the beginning, but as it grows organically, it expands, it's able to really reach wider, and it's able to really also go deeper with that entire process. And as we're also learning pragmatic ways of applying. What happens is, when we talk about Sarvanumati, what comes in our head is this utopian idea saying that, everybody has to agree to everything. But we are saying everybody doesn't have to agree to everything. Everybody has to consent to it. And consent may not mean complete agreement, but may just mean permission to take the action. And in the meanwhile, it may not really affect me as much. It may not be violent toward me, but I'm okay to live with it. It may not be my preferred way of doing that action. So consent in itself is a very workable model. Hence it is permission. Consent, which is anumati, and sahmati is 100% consensus. consensus really means that all of us are agreeing on everything all the time. So consensus may be difficult, but taking consent is not as difficult. It doesn't require as much time as much consensus will require in terms of really sitting together, discussing and thinking. And another point is also very important to consider is the wisdom in the collective. When you take the 100% consent, you've already heard every voice which would have opposed, and also the wisdom of that voice. A lot of times, as the voice of the minority has some wisdom which we ignore or which we do not want to pay attention to. And when that comes into the process, the resistance that you face or we face when we are doing something really reduces. So it becomes like it becomes much more workable as a process, workable as a way of going forward. And in our own experience, we do run projects, we do have deadlines, deliverables, and we've come down to an agreement of a model that works for all of us. And there may be some parts where some decisions may be taken by a fewer number of people, but the group has consented that these few number of people can take these decisions, and everybody in the group doesn't need to be engaged in taking decisions for these a particular projects. And that everybody consents. So it's easier to move forward with that.
Which also leads me to a question that I want to ask both of you. Whoever wants to answer first. You little touched on it already, Kejal. How did this process change you, all of you? Did it change first? And if yes, how? I know it's a personal question, but it's definitely an interesting one.
Sure. Okay, I can start. I think one very, very clear thing I would say, this process has changed each of us. And from all of us who've been part of it, one definitely very clear when we talk about deliverables, outcomes, impact is definitely the personal growth that happens of an individual. Because when you are with a collective, there are higher chances of you disagreeing to things. Somebody bringing out to you things which you may have not liked and something irritating you, something triggering you. But you made this decision by locking up yourself into this 100% consent based decision model that you will walk together irrespective of anything that happens. And that is a great way to learn together from each other. And that is a great way of really also being able to see parts of you, opinions of yours which you wouldn't really otherwise look at or just go away with it. So for me personally, it's been a huge learning to be able to come out and voice my opinion. Most of the times I would have been just okay with, whatever is going on, let's just go with it. And eventually I realized I didn't like the way things happened. And for me, I had to really push myself to see, okay, I do not agree to this. And I really need to come out and say that I don't agree to this for XYZ reason. Because otherwise what would have happened is that I would have just agreed to everybody just because everybody's saying, so just like do it. The process really forced me to ask myself, what do I feel about this as an individual, and do I really understand what this situation asks of me, and now do I consent to this? So it brought that sense of awareness and responsibility, because I know if I consent to it, I will also take the responsibility to make sure that I do it at the end of it. So that for me was a very important shift. Alongside, I also built a lot of patience and understanding of the extremely diverse set of views people can have. I couldn't imagine that for the same situation which I look at it from one way, people could look at it from 100 other dimensions and then come up with it. So that was another very important thing for me.
Ashok, you were particular laughing when the word patience came up. What did it do to you? And how did you perceive what it did to all of you, just also the group as a whole?
So majorly I was laughing because patience has been something that I've gained because of the process. Innately, I have always been a very impatient person, like just wanting to get over things, just wanting to get ahead, and just wanting to like let's get it over with. That kind of a person. So, but this process, since like Kejal mentioned, we have locked ourselves into a 100% consent model. It actually ingrained some level of patience within me. Now I do think twice, thrice. There is how should I put it? There is some level of clarity as well as stillness in me that has been developed because of it. I won't say I'm completely like I'm the most patient person on earth right now. That hasn't happened. But yeah, definitely my patience. If you ask me like 4 years ago how I was and now how I am, it has definitely changed. And this I'm not saying based on what I think, but based on what others have told me, like how much I have changed in that aspect. So patience definitely, and hence that was the reason I was smiling, laughing a bit when Kejal mentioned patience, because that is something common that I have gained. Uh, yeah. Other than that, I feel the 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 feeling of collective, the feeling of being part of a collective and thinking for the collective and not just for yourself. That is something that I have personally gained. I have seen others also, some others also who have inculcated that in themselves. But personally, if I have to see for myself, I have definitely gained that for myself, because how do I go about things? How, instead of thinking how do I go about it, now I want to think. It's not that I need to think, but now I want to think or would like to think, how can we go about it? How can we achieve something? How can we go forward? And not just it has shifted from an I perspective to a we perspective. So definitely that shift, I feel, is there. uh, yeah. And just a lot of acknowledgement of others opinions, I would say, because the person in I was, I guess, 4 5 years back, if you had talked to me, the person I was would have been very brash, would have been very rash, uh, always wanting to be rational. I'm not saying the rationality has gone away. I'm still wanting to be rational, but at the same time wanting to understand what the other person's opinion is. Where is that person coming from? What is the background? Why is that person saying whatever they are saying, and not just brushing it aside just because it doesn't match with my ideology or my thinking.
What I hear from both of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is an enhanced appreciation for the other perspectives. And because it's not just about basically, who is in the majority, and let's just go with what the majority says, but the thing is, you have to come together somehow. And every single one can prevent to come together. So every single perspective has to somehow join the shared will. So, and both of you are nodding as I'm saying that. So, my guess it also teaches one, and maybe this is also connected to the patience that you're to really understand the other perspective for once, and also to find ways how to integrate different perspectives into a shared will, a shared process, and a shared outcome.
Yeah, in fact, I would also kind of expand that to saying that how do you expand your own sense of community or your own sense of care? Like rather than just caring for myself, I start expanding my consciousness to care about people alongside with me and along with me. And that really expands as the individual's identity grows from the I to the we. And the sense of power we feel as a we is so much more stronger, and the sense of strength and support that comes from that we is so much more that when we are moving forward, we know we have an entire collective with us who's going to be walking with us. And that also is inculcated in us a lot of responsibility. As young people, when we a lot of us started, we were in our early 20s. From early 20s to now being in our later 20s, a lot of sense of responsibility has also come up with it. And as newer members in the movement are coming, we're also seeing our own leadership grow with each of this. So how do we uh, grow up at the same time, keep pushing our own edge, and also create space for the next set of people who are coming in, since it's a consent based open flat model in that way. So as in how younger people are coming in, they also ask us same set of questions. And at times they ask us questions saying that, okay, why do you think this is so? And I really want to probably answer that because I've been here for 6 years, I know this is so. But I wouldn't give that as an answer, but I would rather explain myself and give an equal amount of space to that individual for their inquiry, and in that inquiry build a shared learning and understanding, keeping it fresh and alive at the same time. So I would also say what's happening is our leadership skills are growing in terms of our own responsibility and creating space for the next person. I think that's something we keep missing. We just want to keep create build ourselves and keep becoming better people, but how do we also build others, and how do we also expand space and keep widening our idea of the we? I think that's something that's been happening.
I guess one perspective that you will be confronted with from the outside is that, oh yes, you are an idealistic bunch of young people connected by an idealistic cause. I understand that something like this can work with you guys, but in any other circumstances, this doesn't really work. So it's for kind of idealists like you, that's maybe something to work with, but for developing democracy, that's not the case. First, is this a voice that you're hearing, and how you're responding to this?
So when you mentioned the idea of it not working with everyone, I felt it. So it is the case that the collective which we are not the same person. We are part of a collective, but I am so much different than who Kejal is. Kejal is so much different than what some other person from the collective is. So it's not that all of us are idealistic, all of us are thinking the same way for each and everything. The way I would approach things would be sometimes drastically different than what others are doing. So I feel in a way we are bringing in voice of different areas, of different views. So it's not just the idealism that is there. Because personally, I am not an idealistic person. I am that person who would find nooks in each and everything, and how can this not work? Instead of seeing how can it work, my first idea would be what are the ways it can fail, and then working towards it. So if I believe in it, I personally feel if I am believing in it, then it is something that we can give a try for. And that, like Kejal mentioned, is what we are asking. We are not asking that, okay, you be 100% on board with it and be like give your consensus, but 100% consent is what we are asking. That I'm willing to give it a try. I'm okay if this happens. I'm okay to see where this leads. So when we say that it might not work with others, I wouldn't agree personally, because I have seen. So when as part of the campaign which we are doing right now, we have done a actual workshop of experiencing how to make decisions, and we don't have a control who comes in those events, who comes in that session. And even in that session, we were able to build a space, build an atmosphere where people were thinking for each other. People who didn't even know each other were thinking about each other, because the idea is to just give it a try.
And one other question I have, and I'm curious if is this something that you are contemplating? It connects to what I asked in the beginning. India is the biggest democracy on earth, and usually, at least in Europe, one thinks of Europe being the cradle of democracy, and to some degree that's also true, but not completely, and there are other routes. Do you think the experiment that you're in with this deep democracy, consensus democracy, is there something unique Indian in the perspective that basically is also rooted in the Indian culture? And is it something where you think that also other cultures can learn from the Indian experience?
Yeah. So I think I can take that one. One is I wanted to also elaborate a little bit more on this idea of idealism and pragmatism. Somewhere
Okay.
also with India, what is associated is this entire idea of a land of ideals and values, and hence anything being experimented there or anything that comes from there also gets looked at as something, which is much more ethically, morally, and valuistically higher order in so to say way. Whereas a lot of wisdom traditions in India are definitely there, and this comes from some of these wisdom traditions. But I wouldn't say that it does. It is not a practical wisdom tradition that can't be applied. I think what has happened with all of us is, in our experience, the kind of real life experiences we are having, we're not really able to. It's really difficult for us to imagine something beyond that. So we just look at incrementally growing or improving or being better. And when an idea comes which seems like a radical idea, our expectations are so high that we always look at it to be 100% perfect. So instead of being 100% perfect, can we give a certain leeway and say that let's experiment, and can we make it 80%, work with the 80% and try to improvise it. So as we do these workshops, which Ashok was mentioning, where we experiment with Sarvanumati, and at the end when we are reflecting with people, the question that comes up from there also is that, but what about this whole idea that I had to give up my idea and really agree with other people's idea, or there is some sense of sacrifice being there. So how can we kind of, avoid that? Like 100% consent never meant that each person's idea will be fully accepted. 100% consent would require all of us to negotiate and come together. So the idea of what are our idea of ideals also needs to be evaluated, I would say. And then when we are coming together and doing some of these things, initiating them as an experiment, I would say, is the first step. After that, then looking at it and really saying that what is a workable way of taking this forward, because all of us live in times where time and urgency is always part of it. So how do we look at it from that angle and make it work? And I would say it does require some amount of understanding of the concept, some amount of experience and expertise to hold the process in a certain manner, because that, how do you hold the process, really changes in the way you are able to work with the process and learn from the process, and then eventually able to take it in your own setups. So I would say Indian traditions and has one, definitely some of this is innate also for us, just because probably the idea of community is very strong, and hence maybe some of these may be much more easy. But I also feel the idea of individualism is also growing a lot in India, and that also is now getting getting space with the collective, and the idea of individual and collective are also kind of merging together, and hence this becomes in one way a way of looking at it integrally rather than just looking at it either individualistically or as a community, but looking at it as an individual who is part of a community, and then together working with it, finding a way of uh, pragmatic idealism rather than just being ideal or just being very practical.
Ashok, your ideas on this? Do you think there's something particular Indian, and there's also something in Indian perspective that looking from the outside from India, from Europe, as I'm looking here, or looking from other continents, where the Indian experiment is something worth looking and learning from, looking to and learning from?
I'm not sure about the Indianness of the idea, because the idea is based on the concept of non-violence, of including everyone. So I personally feel it will be wrong to say that only Indians do that or Indians believe in the idea of non-violence, because at the core of it, when we consider humanity, we would be non-violent. We would want to be non-violent. We cannot say that India has always been non-violent and the Western countries have been very violent with each other. That's not the idea. So the idea for us, for personally, for the collective which we are part of, for Blue Ribbon Movement, it has emerged from the Indians who have been there before us, from Vinoba, from Gandhi, from Mohan Bhai, from Mendha. But the idea in itself is based on the concept of non-violence and inclusivity. And so I don't think it will be right for me to say that it's an Indian concept, but it's a human concept.
Beautiful. Let me also turn to the future. You learned from Mohan, you learned from the Ghanaian experience, you learned also how Mohan developed this concept in the Indian countryside. You kind of experimented and are experimenting with this in the Mumbai area, in your movement, in the Blue Ribbon movement. You are working with other people, introducing other people to this concept. The campaign that you're running right now is also introducing this concept to broader circles. What's your vision? Where in 5 years, in 10 years, how could this concept unfold, take root? Where do you see this can go, and how would this look like?
I would say one is we're also still learning. So just 3 years into this is, I wouldn't say we're arrived at anything completely. We're still learning. We're also still experimenting and figuring out what are more workable, practical ways of taking it up. But from where we are right now, we've been able to find that this as a process definitely is something which can be really interesting if you're able to develop it in a way that it's transferable. And as a vision, what we're right now trying to do is trying to write down more and more about what we are doing, just to first establish this entire idea that it is possible, just to instill this belief that this is attemptable. And this is the first time we have come out with the Sarvanumati campaign, and we were very nervous and excited both because we've never been out with it. We've done this experiment inside, and most of the time when people would ask us, "What are you doing?" Like, yeah, we're doing this. So we would mostly tell about our projects and a little bit about this because we couldn't really tell it all out, and we didn't expect that everybody would even understand what we're trying to do because it seems like a very radically different idea to even think about, especially in times where we are living. So one is, of course, we want to write a lot. We want to put a lot of knowledge and resources out and just establish that this is possible. And if Mendha is one place where it has been happening for, say, like um, last around 30 years, and they've come up with some really amazing experiences from there, I'm sure we are also onto that and we're also learning from there. So what we would other than this like to do is also build it in a way that the format or the tool or the processes can be taken in different places. So what would be an easy way of experimenting and experiencing this process in say 2 hours or 3 hours? And how can those tools and processes be taken? And as people take them up, they can take and modify it for their own context, and they can take it up in a way that it is applicable and real for them. So we're not saying that everybody has to just do 100% consent. Maybe some of them would want to just do, say, 80% consent. And that's also a great step from where we are. Just the idea of taking consent as a process, just being able to listen also is a great moving ahead from where we are. For us as a movement, we would like to also experiment and do something called as SAN labs and SAN experiments and see if we can use technology in this, because we feel technology can bring in a lot of ease, a lot of scale in terms of the amount of people it can reach in forms of maybe games, activities, and very fun, simple things at the beginning, and not really complex decision making for say our lives, but very simple ways of deciding some things. And from there, then take it up and see if these can be taken to networks, these can be taken to other places of communities, collectives, where people are really interested to attempt it. So I would say that's our broad vision for taking this forward.
Ashok, where do you see this going?
So for me personally, I feel when we talk about the vision of how we want to take Sarvanumati ahead, it is creating more spaces where this can be practiced. Now, it can be practiced in their own versions. Like, for example, Mendha practices it in a more physical space. They meet up. They are physically there together. BRM has adopted it and adapted it in a way that we are able to do it in a virtual space as well, because that's what our need is. That's how it works for us. But what I would want is more and more communities, more and more collectives heading towards it. We cannot be very ideal about it that everyone has to do 100% consent, like Kejal said, that 80% is also a start. It's a good start. But thinking about the collective, thinking about collectively going forward instead of a one person model or a majoritarian model only. So just more and more people and more communities actually giving it a try. Maybe if I may put it that way, that consenting to consent by different communities.
Great. As we are also at the end of our time, I think this is a great last statement, consenting to try consent. And I think that's very much what the experiment is about that you're trying. So thank you very much first for having the courage for this experiment. And also thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so
Ashok.
much for inviting us, Thomas. Really happy to be here, sharing our experiences and ideas, and hope all of you can also join in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.